You know, if you think about it, human beings, I think, all over the world want the same thing. We want safety and security for our families. We don't want to have to want for food or shelter. And when you think about it, I mean, the idea of world peace, I don't think is such a crazy idea. But then we get governments and we get other things that get in the way. I think with most great movements, it starts with people. If you look at all the great movements in human history, they start with people, motivated people. And I think that's what today is about. I think we can get to a day where we have a much more peaceful world, but there's a lot of work to do. Today is about learning what we can do in that process. So I'd like to have our member David Woodward come up. David has done a fantastic job leading our diplomacy task force. What I think is important about that is that David single-handedly has connected this club with the consul generals of a number of nations and leaders from a number of nations, so that Seattle 4 isn't just a Rotary club. It's a club that is connected at a very high level with governments all over the world, especially those from Canada and Mexico, our two closest neighbors. That work has been made possible by this man, so please welcome David Woodward.
Thank you for that intro, Mark. Greetings, honored guests, fellow Rotarians, and a special welcome to World Affairs Council members who are joining us for this special program. We're honored today to be welcoming to the dais Ambassador Rick Barton to be interviewed by Seattle World Affairs Council President and CEO Jacqueline Miller on the topic, the need for American ingenuity in global peace building. This is our first opportunity for Seattle Rotary and the World Affairs Council to collaborate on hosting a speaking event. And we anticipate this will lead to continued collaboration in years ahead. For Rotary International's part, promoting diplomacy globally is a core value going back to the beginnings of Rotary. This is why Seattle Rotary's 60-member diplomacy task force, as well as our Peacebuilders Committee, which has an entire table. Could you all raise your hands at the Peacebuilder Committee? Very important committee. Why both of these were formed just a few years ago to create important events like this, as well as our annual Diplomacy Day, which will be next May, and to partner actively with the Consular Association of Washington throughout the year, as well as all the communities that they represent. We would like to particularly extend our thanks and recognition to all the diplomatic members of Seattle Rotary. If you could stand, the three who are here today, thank you very much for joining us. This is Consul General Lee and Director General Vincent Yao and Consul Roberto Dondish. Thank you very much for your leadership. And their colleagues, I want to thank them in the diplomatic and public service community. I would like to thank in particular past Rotary member John Schroeder for making this happen, along with the World Affairs Council leadership and our current co-chairs for the Diplomacy Task Force, past President Paul Ishii and Director General Vincent Yao of TICO. Those are our current co-chairs of the Diplomacy Task Force. From Korea to Afghanistan, the U.S. military has waged deadly and costly wars in pursuit of peace, as Mark has referenced. Yet have these military interventions produced positive, sustainable change? Ambassador Rick Barton considers this question in his new book, Peace Works, America's Unifying Role in a Turbulent World. Rick Barton is the co-director of the Scholars in the Nation's Service Initiative. His most recent junior task forces cover stabilization and peace building. Barton was the first Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations, U.S. Ambassador to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations in New York, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees at UNHCR, Founding Director of USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives, and a business and political leader in Maine earlier in his career, near the other Portland. Interviewing Rick is Seattle's own Jackie Miller, an executive of 20 years of high-profile experience in policy, strategy, and management. Jackie has led the World Affairs Council of Seattle since May 2014. Before moving west, Jackie held senior positions in policy organizations and nonprofits on the East Coast. where much of her work focused on diplomacy and national security. Jackie currently serves as on the Mayor's Seattle International Affairs Advisory Board, where Rotary is also represented. Thank you, Rick and Jackie, for joining us today. And I must say I was pleased to find out that Jackie is also originally from Australia, so she's actually one of our international visitors today, although she doesn't sound like it. Right, Ken? Sorry. Anyway, I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yes, David did reference I'm a stealth Australian, but as of April of this year, also a U.S. citizen, and looking forward to casting my ballot for the very first time as soon as I fill that in at home. Well, thank you, David, for that kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here at Rotary, thrilled that Rick is joining us today. And it's not just been today. We have been running Rick ragged. I started him off at 0:30 yesterday, meeting with my fellows. You've been to Lakeside, to Franklin, to Microsoft, to UW, here at Rotary, done a book club. I'm missing some things, some happy hours. So. So what we're going to have is a nice, relaxing conversation. We would be delighted to welcome Rotarians to our community programs, where we regularly have debate, discussion, and dialogue on global issues. We don't sing. We'll think about it. But we talk about everything from the use of digital technology to help overcome poverty and famine by looking at smallholder farmers in Africa. In a few weeks, we have the lead negotiator on the Iran deal, the lead U.S. negotiator, I should clarify, on the Iran deal coming out here, and to events like the one with Rick Barton today. It's all about providing a forum to engage on the issues that matter to us globally. And there's really no shortage of challenges, of trends, but also of opportunities that we could talk about. You just need to look at the news globally, domestically, to see there's a lot going on. A lot of it's really challenging. Some of these problems seem really intractable. And when we have events at the Council on Foreign at the World Affairs Council, we have a Council on Foreign Relations guest tomorrow. When we have these conversations at the World Affairs Council, I often challenge our speakers to take us out on a positive note, right? To find some silver lining for these challenges. And one of the things I'm looking forward to today is that we're starting from a position of optimism, right? That optimism that we can do good in the world, that we want to do good in the world, and that we have the tools to do good in the world. We just need to embrace maybe some different tools than we've traditionally used when you're thinking about diplomacy and peace building. I think if anyone has a right not to be an optimist, it's Ambassador Rick Barton, who has been engaged in 40 conflicts over his 24-year career: Rwanda, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, some of the really, really hard places where U.S. troops are still today, where civilians are still dying today. And yet Rick is an optimist that we can make a difference, that peace building can work, and we need to look back at what hasn't worked and just make some changes as to how we go forward. So part of my job today is to challenge that optimism, but I'm pretty confident that you're going to leave as optimistic as Rick is about what we can do. And also, if you want to pick up a copy of his book, I highly recommend it. And Rick is going to stick around for a few minutes and sign copies. It's also... Yeah, it's also a good chance to get to chat with Rick briefly, who brings an amazing experience to today's conversation. What I want to do and what Rick wants to do is, as quickly as possible, bring you into the conversation. If you've been to World Affairs Council events, you know I generally abuse my moderator position and ask a whole bunch of questions because I'm really interested in this stuff. But our goal is to just start the conversation and then turn it over to you. So please be thinking about your questions. Peacebuilding Committee, I'm looking at you. And Mark gave you some of the things that we're going to be thinking about and talking about: military intervention, Syria, Afghanistan. Where did it go right? What did it look like when it went wrong? So we will get to those. I want to touch quickly first on the innovation thing before looking at some of these lessons learned. And in your book, you say, and I think this is kind of music to folks' ears here in Seattle, that America should think of itself more as a venture capitalist when it comes to peace building, act more like a venture capitalist than a pension manager. These are not venture capitalism, not normally something we associate with the State Department or being on the ground. What does that mean?
Well, first off, thank you, Jackie, and thank you all for just the positive feeling in this room. It's such a lift, and also for the wonderful hospitality of today and of Seattle. I can just say a couple things about if I could, about the Rotary. My very first talk in New York when I was one of the U.S. ambassadors to the UN was on polio. And the Rotary was the other key partner. So it was UNICEF and Rotary that were really the drivers in this whole effort. And one of my friends from Maine, Mike McGovern, was the leader for Rotary International. So thank you for that great work, and it really matters. Your commitment to peace is felt on the ground by real people. And we need you because it can't all be done at the official level, no matter how capable sometimes the government and the multilaterals can be. As I was looking at this behind me, it reminded me obviously of my grandmother. There was a rule of, she had a rule of thumb, which was that you could not, if you said something that was a little bit unkind, she would ask, is it kind, is it true, is it necessary? And that hasn't held up all that well. But it's good that you've added a fourth principle as well, because those are not bad guideposts for all of us to follow. One thank you that I have to extend for sure is to one of your local peace builders, John Schroeder, who is not here today, but his parents are. And I see his mom and his dad just walked in a timely way. Maybe you could stand up and be recognized. John actually has done the work in Kenya, in Afghanistan, and now he's back here in his home state. And he's just a wonderful colleague, and I thank him for giving me this opportunity through Paul. And I love the origami, Paul. I mean, that's the cover of my book as well. So it's really very touching to have that today. So thank you so much. Now, why should we be venture capitalists rather than pension managers? Well, we're working in the riskiest places on earth. And so is it going to work to go in there in a hyper-cautious way, sort of the most predictable way, whatever you happen to have in the inventory in the warehouse, or do you need to look at these things more creatively, accept the risk in particular? One of the tests that I would give, I've never had a crowd of this size at the State Department, but if 25 or more were gathered, I would test my colleagues on how do we deal with the question of risk. And the way I like to do it was to offer up what I call a virtuous scale. Either end of the scale is something very good. So one end of the scale is native caution. That's pretty good. It keeps you from doing really stupid stuff. And the other end of the scale was American ingenuity. And I would ask my colleagues in the State Department, where do you think we fall as an institution? Where are we as an institution? And 95% would say we are smack up against native caution. But there are always 5% who are wise guys. Guess where they said we were? Beyond native caution. So we have that down quite well. We know how to be careful and move cautiously, and not always in how we get into these places, but oftentimes in what we do there, and we look for the familiar. Now, I happen to believe that a venture capitalist doesn't invest in every opportunity that comes his way, and the United States is a very advantaged country. We are the most advantaged nation on earth. We have the opportunity to actually be in the room for peace talks. We have the opportunity to be asked, what should we do in this crisis situation in our country? That is not true of most of the countries on earth. When I was the ambassador, I knew I could see my colleagues from other countries waiting to hear what the United States had to offer. So you have to take this position very carefully and with lots of humility. and we don't always know the places, so getting in is one really very careful thing we have to take care of. Obviously, venture capitalists do that kind of work, do that kind of research. But understand that if we make peace in 1 out of 10 places, we have had a very big impact on the world. And it's an impact that we will all benefit from, whether it's in business or as a tourist or because your children have an interest in it. So to do this work, you have to have that mindset. And if you don't, you're likely to be overrun by the situation.
So I want to come back to knowing the place in a minute. I guess it's a huge part of your book, but I want to come to something that Mark said that also resonated for me because it's a central focus of your book. And Mark said it starts with the people. And in the book, one of your takeaways after working so long in so many conflict areas is that the only way that the United States can effectively peace build is to engage the American people in that struggle. Now, we are coming up on midterm elections next week, and it will be a record turnout if participation of eligible voters breaks 47%. That doesn't show terrific engagement in a way where it's really easy to engage. And when you're talking about these international conflicts, these conflicts that are so far away, that they're in our news feeds, but do they really resonate anything more than a sad story that we're seeing? So it's kind of a twofold question. Not kind of, it is a twofold question. How do you engage the American people in this struggle? And are you confident that the American people want to engage?
Yeah. Well, the American public today is actually reluctant to engage, and the numbers really show that. And even in a crisis, if you take a crisis like Syria, where we've gone from a peaceful demonstration for change to over 400,000, nearly 500,000 deaths, if you look at Google searches, the American interest in Syria has been at a very low level and very flat for the entire conflict. Whether it was 7,000 people who had died or 500,000 people, the level of engagement was very low. That only changed twice. So there have been 2 spikes that were huge during the Syrian war. One was when President Obama said that the red line had been crossed, the gassing of citizens was unacceptable. The United States would do something if the United States Congress went along with it. And that generated a huge bump in interest. The Americans had been polled, and 15% said they were interested in Syria before that. 45% within 2 weeks said that they were interested in. So policy could drive interest, obviously, and it did in that case. The second time was when the little boy was found dead on the beach in Greece. And that was by far the most engaged moment in the American public life. Now, I don't think that the work we're doing in these countries is anywhere near as good as it could be, and the book really describes many ways to do it better. But the book also dedicates really a chapter to how the American public has to be more engaged. Because if the last 20 wars that the United States has been involved with, there is not a congressional mandate to support it, then the people don't have that initial expression of, is this something we want to get into? And the debate is never going to be as rich as it has to be before we make that kind of sacrifice of thousands of lives and of trillions of dollars. So the first thing is, let's have the Congress fulfill its obligation to actually take action on these kinds of interventions. That happens to be something that both sides of the political spectrum really agree on. But then it's more than that. Now, with our all-volunteer military, we don't have the connection to these kinds of conflicts that we did when my father served as a Marine on Iwo Jima, and virtually everybody around him was involved in that particular conflict. So that's the second part. A third part is we get into these interventions and we're pretty much told don't worry, you won't have to pay for it. There will be no new taxes. So you can see that opportunity and responsibility really have to go together. I may have pushed this button. Oh, no, it's red now, so. Are they giving me a message to shorten up these answers? Let's see if I can take it. Maybe when we move to the floor, we'll go for true or false, and I can meet the time limits that are required. So these, to me, are the entry points in our system. But opportunity and responsibility are big, big parts of what we have to do as citizens. And if we do those, I have no doubt that the performance of our government and of our multilateral organizations will improve. It always improves when the public cares about what's going on. Now, to answer sort of the core of your question, even though the numbers are not big now in terms of supporting this kind of work, I have always found that people have a deep interest in these things. And that Americans, when I go out and talk to groups that are really apolitical, and many of the people I've talked to here in Seattle were not really on these issues over the last, until we met over the last few days. The interest is genuine because we not only recognize that we have an advantaged position and that the state of world peace, the United States not being in conflict with any major opponent since really World War II, that has redounded to our benefit over and over and over again, but also our sense of responsibility and the values that we try to project, and that obviously the Rotarians do as well. So I believe there's a deep-seated interest, but we have to uncork it, and really the book is written for people like you, concerned citizens. It is not written for policymakers. I hope they'll get something out of it because I think there are advantages, but it's written to try to mobilize the public spirit in these really important opportunities.
Can I just turn it off?
You want to share?
Oh, I think we're good. It's green now. So staying on the ingenuity theme in peace building, one of the things that you're recommending is taking advantage of local ingenuity. And you hinted at this a bit when you said you have to know the place before you go in. You better know the place before you go in to improve your chance of success. So we have to be much better at supporting locally driven solutions, to not think that we necessarily have all the answers, right? It's a very humble approach to U.S. diplomacy, which is not necessarily one of our strengths, going in humbly, thinking we may not know the answers. But if we invest in local initiatives, then we can kind of jumpstart promising change. Can you give us some examples of what are some of these local initiatives that have worked, that have made a difference, and just, pick one or two of the 40-odd conflicts that you've been working on?
So maybe one to start on is actually to talk about one that John Schroeder was involved in Kenya. So Kenya had a violent election in 2007. Over 1,000 people had been killed. Over 500,000 people had been chased out of their homes, never to go back. Kenya did all the necessary things. They changed their constitution. They gave more authority to their Supreme Court. They appointed a new police chief. They went at the problem in sort of a technocratic fashion. But as you traveled around Kenya and you asked people, what worries you most? They said election-related violence in the coming election. So whatever they were doing, that seemed to be what was most on their minds. Even as youths on the street could talk to you about a section of the Constitution that outlawed hate speech, they knew that that wasn't going to be enough, that there would have to be something more to maintain the peace. And working with John in the Rift Valley, which is where most of the violence had been in that part of Kenya, very lush part of Kenya, we had a meeting one day with about a dozen Kenyan organizations that actually received some funding from the United States government. And rather than having them all report to us why they were doing brilliant work, we asked them, what worries you most? And they said, the upcoming election, election-related violence, politically driven violence managed by the leadership of the major parties. And so we then asked them, are you doing everything about that that you'd like to be doing? And they said no. And we said, what might you bring to a peace-building effort? And the first person to speak was a man who said, I run a horticulture program, and I only have 400 farmers, so I'm not sure what I could bring to this. And I said to him, you know, I'm from the United States, and I've been involved in politics, and if you start with 400 farmers, I could probably be elected governor of any state except for Texas. The Kenyans reacted the same way you did. They somehow knew that there was influence in that group of people. So the next person to speak was a woman running an AIDS program. And she said, well, you know, we only knock on 200,000 doors a week. So you get the idea. There was a lot going on there, and they were all ready to go. But there was one thing that was keeping them from really getting involved in the peace-building side of this election effort, which John and others were organizing. They'd gotten the local Pepsi-Cola bottler. They'd gotten the local Episcopal bishop, the local Catholic bishop. They'd gotten all the usual suspects together, and they were doing a pretty good job. But we had to explode the number somehow. We had to reach many more people, increase the connection between the police and the civil society and these people, and have people expressing their rejection of hate speech at political rallies. And now we could see very quickly that there was this energy already there, but they had a very common problem. They had other jobs. They were doing their daily work. And so we said to them, okay, what would it take to really mobilize, to take this asset you have and to inject it into the political system? And they said, you know, if I could hire one more person who could just work that portfolio, connect what I'm doing to this issue, which I care so much about, or if I could have 2 or 3 people, the AIDS person needed more, obviously. So we said, you know, what would that cost, and how long would it take you to hire somebody? They said, probably take about 2 weeks, probably cost a couple $1,000s to hire someone for 6 months. Now, so for $600,000 of US taxpayers' money, we mobilized that entire area. We could have sent 2 Americans for that amount. But 2 Americans having to get to know the place, not speaking the language, not being able to work, just never gonna have the impact. So there it was just sitting there waiting to be taken advantage of. And in these cases, I like opportunism, and I like exploiting, and because we're not taking ownership. It's not about the United States being a colonial power. We're being a catalyst for what's already there. And I think that's the position that we want to find ourselves in.
So I have, I have one quick follow-up, and if we can get the microphones ready to turn to your questions. So you talk about you and John being on the ground in Kenya in 2007, but the conflicts we're talking about now are Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, where the risk profile is daunting. And Americans are targets in ways that they have not necessarily been before. Is the prescription still the same in these kind of conflict areas?
Well, thank you. I mean, these are obviously great questions, and hopefully you'll get fuller answers from the book as well. I do spend a lot of time on Syria, and because I do think there were, as any conflict that gets worse and worse and worse and worse, there are tons of missed opportunities. Not that it would have necessarily stopped the conflict, but in a case like Syria, this doesn't quite answer your question, but just maybe to contextualize it a bit. Just about every time that I spend time in a war, or a war zone, or in a place that's heading towards increasing violence, there tend to be common themes, words that you hear over and over again that you need to be responsive to. You have to listen to what the people of the place are saying. And in Syria, very early on, the one word that every Syrian would spend the first 15 minutes of any meeting with anybody on was bombing. You have to stop the bombing, because the bombing was just, it was targeting hospitals and schools. It was killing thousands of people, and it was completely indiscriminate, and it was the weapon of choice by the Assad regime. And there was no real counter to that. Now, the United States public wasn't ready to get into it. President Obama wasn't ready to get into it without the support of the Congress. And you can say at any one time the United States has a lot going on, and the President of the United States tends to be busy. And I thought that he showed admirable restraint. But in the course of showing admirable restraint, you also have to come up with other ways of addressing these problems. And I thought there were at least two things that were available to us. They're not available necessarily now. One of them, conceivably, but it's pretty far down the line. One was basically to make it clear to the Assad regime, because I saw the Assad regime as a rational player. I didn't see Saddam Hussein and Muammar and Gaddafi as being rational players. They were teenage boys who somehow got to run a country for 30 years. And it was like, this is insane. But the Assad people were so well organized, father and son, highly rational, that they would respond to rational actions and rational threats, I felt. And rather than the United States going in and attacking them, I thought we should have made it clear that if you attack hospitals, if you attack with gas, your citizens with gas, we can almost give you a list of the military targets and the personal residences that we believe are worthy of a response. So every time you want to be, every time you would like to be attacked, that's the way you will know when it's about to happen. And our weaponry doesn't depend on surprise, really. It's not of that nature any longer. So that was one. But the second one was, I believe that we needed an assertive humanitarianism. Now, the one set of rules that most of the world agrees on is the humanitarian principles. Free access to people who are suffering, to get them out of suffering situations. That has been violated over and over and over again in Syria, despite the Russians and the Chinese voting for resolutions to support the humanitarian delivery of relief. Now, I felt that the Berlin airlift, the Sarajevo airlift, some of the air humanitarian work that we brought to Kosovo, that those were cases that were not warmly received by our opposing superpowers, but they were accomplished, and they changed the nature of the conflict. And I thought humanitarian airlifts into Aleppo from the very beginning would have made it clear that you didn't have to take all of your humanitarian assistance through Damascus, and then it would be controlled by the regime, that it was going to now go more directly to the people. And any time that you can give the people a greater voice at any stage of a conflict and not put them at higher risk, which is a danger, you are probably making progress at ending the conflict.
Well, let's see how many questions we can get in before we give Ken a heart attack. Let's start at the peacebuilding table, please. And if we can just make sure that our questions end in question marks and not exclamation points, that would be terrific.
Thank you for your remarks. Quick question. You've been talking about conventional conflicts. What about cyber war, and what does cyber peace look like?
Well, I can assure you I'm not an expert on this. But I think what I can say about it is that we're entering a period of what is getting close to mutually assured destruction. It used to be that only if the other people had nuclear weaponry did you have to worry about mutually assured destruction. But now, if they can mount a cyber attack on you, you can pretty much take out the lights in their city the next day. The same thing for terrorism. It only takes 1 or 2 or 3 terrorists coming from anywhere. It's a very low entry business. It doesn't take a lot of skill or talent. Almost anybody can do it. And if somebody launches a terrorist attack or supports one in your community, you can easily do it in their community. So we're at and the same thing for climate change. If we pollute randomly and with great abundance, then other people will do the same thing, and suddenly we're all drowning. So it's actually going to become a more codependent era than it has been, because the threats are more common than they were. They were highly technical, highly expensive. And so to think that you can isolate yourself from the world, it's actually an argument. These threats, like cybersecurity, are arguments for we have to reach out. We actually have to upgrade our act as individuals, and we're going to have to find new ways of cooperating. And that's almost directly counter to sort of our trend line right now, how we think. We think that if we're in this safe place, nothing could ever go wrong but actually it can. And it's not to scare you, that's not my message. My message is there are lots of great ways to do this. They're not that hard, and let's get on it.
Go to this side of them.
Gallup just released a poll in which they identified that even in our own country, college students don't think that speech that they disagree with is appropriate, to the point that they think violence may be acceptable to deny speech. When you're in an intractable situation and one party doesn't want to see the other party's viewpoint as appropriate and violence is appropriate, how do you bring those two parties together?
It's sort of, that question reminds me of a recent introduction. Somebody said, Rick Barton's worked on 40 wars, and most of them are still at war. I was like, so obviously, so I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer, but actually bringing people together sometimes is too optimistic. You know, I've been involved with people who started projects that were titled Imagine Coexistence. I think the Bosnian peace agreement, it's not a brilliant peace agreement, but it kept people from killing each other on a daily basis. And my belief was that within 10 years, some Croatian farmer is going to say, you know, do I have to drive 50 miles to deliver that tomato when I can go 3 miles to the market that I used to go to? And some Bosniak is going to say, I don't have anybody to go to a movie with tonight. Maybe I could go with that person who I haven't spoken to in 10 years. So I believe that these things can happen. In the early work that we had in Bosnia, the U.S. policy was starting to be built at the end of the war, was starting to be built around the idea of people really coming together. And we sent an expert out there, a guy who, Bob Gersoni, who a book is being written about him right now, who basically spent 3 or 4 months out there, and he said, these people are not ready to come together. So the U.S., the ideal of the U.S. policy is not going to work. And he looked at the programs that we had going on in the country, and he said, of your 9 programs, he said something flattering before he floored us. He said, I've never seen such honest reporting in the U.S. government, but nothing you're doing is working. And so he took one little program that we had where there were 9 houses and right on a front line, and 5 Croats on one side were fixing their houses with our help, and 4 Bosniaks on the other side of the line. And he said, that's a pretty good model because everybody wants to fix their houses. You can do it for about $10,000 a pop. These are decent houses in Bosnia. There's really a middle-class society. And you can get the people back into their houses. If you get them back into their houses, they have to fix the rest of it. All we're going to do is, because the way they destroyed houses during the Bosnian War was they blew out the windows, they blew out the door, and then they had a grenade that burnt the roof out. So that's what we did, is we got them back into the house. And that ended up being the heart of the biggest U.S. intervention in that place. And I think it helped to get to this place today. No war for 25 years. Not so good. I mean, there's still lots wrong, and the political system is still run by many of the same people. But sometimes you have to start that first step before you expect people to take that bigger step.
Okay. Sorry. This will be our last question. It's a 1-minute question followed by a 2-minute response.
That's impossible.
For you, it's going to be impossible. Any ideas of a humanitarian strategy for Yemen? I mean, I don't even know where to donate money anymore because my understanding is nothing is getting through to help these starving people.
So I don't know the Yemen case as well as I should, as I'd like to, but I'm basically a citizen now, so I'm following it the way you are. I would go to free and open access to every part of the country as the test. And I think this is where the peacekeeping forces, probably international, probably United Nations, need to focus their attention. There will be people, just as there were in the Bosnian War and other wars, who have checkpoints, who steal things as they're going through, who tax everything that happens. But if they know that this is going to be done, it's going to happen, they will adjust to it, and they will adjust to it. Sometimes it will need force even to which is very difficult for humanitarians to accept. But this is not that pretty a world, and sometimes you have to use these kinds of approaches to make it happen. So for me, it's about open and free access. Look at the map, see what areas are not getting anything, and start making sure that humanitarian assistance gets to them.
So my mic is dead, so I think that's the time.